Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats, we'll get started. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. We're delighted to welcome Sebastian Mallaby to the Council. He's here talking about his new book on Alan Greenspan's legacy and lessons for the Fed in the Trump era, a hot topic these days. He'll be signing the book after the program. So you may have heard this week that it was the FT's Book of the Year with McKinsey, and the Council is actually very proud that we generally pick these winners. Of the last 7, we've had 4 of them attend at the Council or confirmed their attendance before they actually won the prize, so we feel like we're a bit of a lucky charm. So maybe that's why you didn't win the last one in 2011, but it was still a notable book. But we're glad to have you here this time. Thanks very much to the Council on Foreign Relations. They're a great partner of ours in New York and Washington, so thank you very much for working with us on that. Tonight's program's on the record, will be live streamed, but if you could please silence your phones, that would be terrific so that it doesn't interrupt the program. This is the 5th event in our fantastic global economy series this fall. You may recall we've hosted Lael Brainerd, Carmen Reinhart, Joe Stiglitz, and Mohammed Al-Arian. Those are all available on our website for live stream, for video, if you'd like to look at them now. A few other programs before the holidays start. Victor Yuan, who's our Scholl Fellow, will be here tomorrow night, talking about opportunity and entrepreneurship in China today. And then next week we'll welcome Thomas Vukta from the OCSE and Bob Pape talking about European counterterrorism strategies. And then on December 14th, we'll welcome Jeff Garton and Ed Luce on globalization in the age of division. As many of you know, for nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. And the views expressed by individuals that we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions of the Council. Now back to tonight, just a few brief words about Sebastian's extremely impressive CV. He's the Paul Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at CFR. He contributes to the Washington Post. He was previously a staff columnist and editorial board member at the Washington Post, a contributing editor at the FT, Washington bureau chief, and Lexington columnist at The Economist, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, several books, and his last book was More Money Than God, Hedge Funds and the Making of a New Elite. So we're simply delighted to have you here, Sebastian. I'll be back up for the Q&A. Now please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Thank you.
So thank you for that great introduction. As was just explained, I've written a few books. By way of self-introduction and also to celebrate my return to Chicago, because although you forgot, I have been here before after one book, let me just give you the quick background on this writing trajectory. So when I was in my 20s, I was outside Mandela's jail in South Africa when he came out, and I realized at the age of 25 that my career would be downhill from there on, because nothing could be more exciting than watching Mandela came out. So spotting an opportunity, I realized that all the other current affairs books about South Africa were out of date, and I wrote one in 3 months, and that's when I got my first invitation to come to Chicago and speak here, was after the publication of that book. So in my 20s, 3 months. Then in my 30s, I wrote a book about the World Bank, and this took me 1 year and 3 months. And then in my 40s, I wrote a history of hedge funds, and this took me 4 years. And now I'm 52, and I'm here, and I've written a book about Alan Greenspan. It took me more than 5 years. And my kids, who are not always nice to me, say, this is not a sustainable trajectory. You cannot go on taking longer and longer and longer every time. So what I say to them is that actually the 5 years in this case were justified. And I want to just quickly explain why I spent so much time on this project, and then relate this and what I learned to the challenges that I see coming up in the era of Donald Trump for the Fed and the kind of future of monetary policy, and more broadly, the position of experts in policy making in Washington, D.C., which I think is a bit under attack. So the thing I tell my kids, and I'll tell you as well, is that, Greenspan is a special case. So 5 years, it's actually quite a brief period to spend on a book. And it starts with the point that if you're thinking about post-war financial history, financial statecraft, Greenspan is the preeminent figure. I mean, the other major figures we can think of in post-war finance, Paul Volcker was chairman of the Fed for 8 years, Ben Bernanke was chairman of the Fed for 8 years, Alan Greenspan, 18 and a half, plus 2.5 years as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Ford White House. So add that up, it's 21 years. And we could even be a bit cheeky about this and say it's not just financial statecraft. It's frankly, you could extend it to geopolitics. I mean, who is the preeminent figure in post-war US geopolitical history, arguably Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, 8 years in government. My friend Neil Ferguson might say, yes, but, there were times when he was Secretary of State and National Security at the same time, so maybe you get to multiply that by 2. And I say, yeah, but Neil, 2 times 8 is still only 16. My guy, 21 years. Neil, you're writing 2 volumes about Kissinger. I'm only writing 1 volume about Greenspan. This is an act of mercy and concision in terms of what I'm inflicting on the reading public. So that's reason number 1. I mean, Greenspan, I think, does stand out as the preeminent post-war financial statesman. Reason number 2 is that, he went from being the maestro in the era of the great moderation in the 90s, when everything was going great, to the villain after the financial crash of 2008. So he went from hero to zero faster than anybody else I can think of in public life. And so that's an invitation for a writer to come in and try and set the judgment at the right level. And the third thing, which I didn't anticipate as I got into it, but became more and more evident as I went along, is that Alan Greenspan is a more interesting person than you might realize. I mean, so you think of the besooted central banker speaking soberly and, with great gravitas about trucking capacity utilization in Indiana or other such subjects. What you don't remember is perhaps that this is the person who in his mid-30s in 1959 bought the Buick Electra 225 convertible with red leather seats on the inside and chrome on that, snarling radiator grille on the front, and one of those double hoop steering wheels with, chrome on the inside and red leather on the outside, enormous tail fins to make his shoulders look bigger as you watched him drive along those interstate highways which were new in the 50s. And the whole thing looked like a cross between, I don't know, a killer shark and a fighter aircraft. And he would drive this monstrous confection down the East Side Highway in Manhattan at a pace which, according to one of his former girlfriends, was what modern central bankers would say was not a moderate pace. And he would get speeding ticket after speeding ticket, but he was earning plenty of money, so he paid them without noticing too much. You think of the sober, besooted central banker as well, but you may not realize that Alan Greenspan had a particular approach to his personal life. He was not against marriage. He did it twice, but he was single between the age of 27 and 71. This is an unusual formula. And in this interim, as he explained to me, he dated senators, beauty queens, and news anchors. And I would only add, not always sequentially. And so he had a more interesting life than people realize. And the really important thing is that the intellectual story, the intellectual development, is way more fascinating than anything that I've just been describing about his personal life. I mean, this is a person who had written a PhD thesis which was lost from NYU library, which NYU had awarded the PhD. But when friends of mine at the Wall Street Journal, who were very good reporters, went and tried to get a copy of this PhD early in Greenspan's Fed tenure, they were told by the librarian, sorry, can't see it, it's lost, sorry. And they would say, come on. And they tried hard, and they couldn't get this thing. And I would go and see Alan in my early research. I would go see him every couple of weeks, spend a couple of hours in his office, and we'd be talking. Whenever I asked him about his early intellectual development, he would sort of do this. And he would be looking up at the shelf. And after a while, I looked up at the shelf too, and there was this binder, a kind of PhD-sized binder. And I went, and I said, Alan, it would be really great, since we're talking about your intellectual development, if I could have a copy of your PhD thesis, I said. And seeing me look up at the shelf, he admitted he had it, and he gave it to me. And when I got it home and I read it, the central paper around which the PhD is organized is a description of how the main duty of central banks is to combat asset price bubbles. I mean, you can't make this up. The person who later was laid low by bubbles had said that was the central thing that central banks should focus on during his period when he was in his 30s and so forth. This is what he was focusing on. Later, I knew that Greenspan had collaborated a lot with the rather cultish libertarian novelist Ayn Rand. He'd been her de facto chief economist. He'd written or edited bits of her Atlas Shrugged, the bits about the economy and about steel, which was an industry that he knew very well. So I knew that Ayn Rand was a bit of a control freak. You couldn't give a speech in her name without her checking the text first. So I assumed that somewhere, someplace, the text of Alan Greenspan's speeches under the auspices of the Ayn Rand Institute, which I'd heard he had delivered, these things must be written down someplace. But I contacted various Ayn Rand institutes. I couldn't find where the text was. Nobody seemed to have it until I went to see the person who was the punch card operator for the Greenspan consulting company's mainframe computer in the 1960s. You had to feed all these punch cards in. It was very laborious. So you had somebody on the staff whose job was basically to look after these machines. And so I went to see this person. I had to drive out of Washington to a place where he'd retired in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. There was a kind of a cabin surrounded by woods, one person living there. And I was intending to ask questions simply about what it was like to have Alan Greenspan as a boss in the 1960s. And it turned out that this person was an obsessive Ayn Rand fanatic as well. And in his basement, there was the full collection of Ayn Rand memorabilia, including the 300-page transcript of Greenspan's speeches at the Ayn Rand Institute. So I was very excited. I got a copy of this thing. And as I read this, I came across this quotation, which really is too good to make up. In these lectures, Greenspan holds forth to the effect that the creation of the Federal Reserve was an historic disaster. An historic disaster. The institution that Greenspan embodied is one that he thought should not have been created. So Greenspan's development, his intellectual story, takes him from being, obsessed with bubbles to being laid low by those same bubbles, to not believing there should be a central bank because he thinks there should be a gold standard, to embodying and personifying the central bank. From being the gold advocate to being the chief printer of paper money. And so if you wanted to kind of think about debates in monetary policy, you didn't need to depart the confines of Greenspan's head, right? Both extremes were inside there. And that made him a fascinating character to explore. So those are some of the reasons why I was drawn into this project, why I spent so long on it. But I want to relate through the last two things that strike me about this project. I want to relate this to sort of what's going on now. Because the fourth thing that I find distinctive about studying the career of Alan Greenspan is that when you think about today, when you think about the revolt against elites and the revolt against experts, which is present obviously both in Britain, where during the Brexit campaign, one of the pro-Brexit campaigners, Michael Gove, said, this country has had enough of experts. It's obvious there, it's obvious somewhat in the kind of anti-establishment flavor of President-elect Trump's campaign. It's obviously true in other populist movements in Europe. This attack on experts is to some extent an attack on what Greenspan represented. Because Greenspan was the ultimate expert who parlayed that expertise into serious political power. And I think, one of the things I discovered as I went through the process of writing this book is quite how political Greenspan himself was, and how political the Fed was, is, and will be in the future. And we're going to notice that more with a Trump presidency, I think. And so, I discovered along the way, Greenspan's public life began as he signed on to the Nixon campaign in 1967, and under the tutelage of Richard Nixon, learned how to play politics. I found all the letters that Greenspan, all the memos that Greenspan had written to Nixon, and they begin with straight economic advice, a bit of libertarian philosophical advice, and they transition from that to talking about polling analysis, because Greenspan used the mainframe computer with those punch cards to analyze regional polls for Nixon. And then from the polling analysis, Greenspan moved into messaging advice and pure spin, and even advising Nixon not to say things about his position, not to be honest about where he was, because it would cost him politically. So in the course of this 18 months on the Nixon campaign in 67 and 68, Greenspan had a sort of political apprenticeship. And this continues on into the 70s. He joins the Ford White House. He fights pitched bureaucratic battles with people like Henry Kissinger, and he beats them, because Greenspan becomes better at sneaking into the White House on a weekend with allies who think that the president's speech needs to be rewritten, and taking the draft that had been rewritten during the week, that had been composed in the week by another faction in the administration, and persuading President Ford that it could be tweaked a little bit and then a bit more, and then finally there's an entirely new speech during this kind of, this weekend operation, so that the losing faction comes into the office on Monday and discovers that their policy has been reversed. Greenspan went up against Kissinger on an issue about doing oil deals with the Shah of Iran. And what was amazing was not just that, Kissinger wound up losing that fight, but that he remained Greenspan's friend afterwards. Greenspan was so skillful at defeating his enemies through sort of subtle, passive-aggressive tactics as opposed to head-on confrontation, that even his enemies sort of liked him at the end of it. And these turned out to be very relevant skills when Greenspan became Fed chairman. Because if you want to understand sort of what's going on now with Donald Trump attacking Janet Yellen in the course of that first debate between Clinton and Trump, that was the first direct attack on a Fed leader. You have to go back at least to the George H.W. Bush administration to find something that direct. In other words, you have to go back to the early Greenspan period to find the executive attacking the independence of the Fed like that. And so if you want to understand how the Fed deals with that, it's worth thinking about how Greenspan dealt with it. And the answer is that he parlayed those political skills he had learned in the 60s and 70s, tricks about leaking to the press and getting your enemies to be embarrassed by stories in the press. He did this again when he was being attacked in the early 1990s. So just to set the scene for you there, we think sometimes of Fed independence as, it's been around for so long that it was always there. Well, actually, Paul Volcker, despite being a very tough Fed leader, despite being that, rumpled Churchillian sort of Old Testament sage who defeated inflation, was surrounded by Reagan appointees on the board of the Fed in the latter years of his tenure, who outvoted him on interest rates once and drove Volcker to leave the room, slam the door, write a letter of resignation, and then be talked out of it reluctantly, and then turn around and find he was outvoted again by his committee a couple of times on regulatory issues. So Volcker was surrounded by people that the Reagan administration had put into the Fed to undermine him. And then when Greenspan took over in 1987, the same thing, the same pattern was extended. During the George H.W. Bush administration, Dick Darman was the budget director, and he would go around Washington whispering to people, Alan Greenspan, 65 years old, lives by himself, calls his mother every day. Bit creepy. Does this remind you of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho? So there was a tough, fight against the Fed to try to bully it and embarrass it into cutting interest rates to help George H.W. Bush, who always blamed Greenspan when Greenspan resisted that for the loss of the 1992 election. And Greenspan resisted this pressure by these tricks that I mentioned. When the Treasury Secretary was particularly vocal in criticizing Greenspan's monetary policy, there was a moment when the two of them were going to sit next to each other and testify in Congress before the same committee. And it just so happened that on that morning, Nick Brady found that in the Wall Street Journal, there was a very long article describing him as intellectually unfit to be Treasury Secretary and likely to be pushed out rather soon. Now, I can't prove that the journalist who wrote that spoke to Alan Greenspan, but knowing the pattern of Greenspan's career, it would shock me if he hadn't. And anyway, the two of them were sitting there next to each other in front of this committee, and inevitably at one point there was a question to Nick Brady, which elicited a slightly convoluted answer from the Treasury Secretary. And when the committee member turned to Greenspan and said, "So, Mr. Chairman, the Treasury Secretary has said such and such, what is your comment on it?" Greenspan paused and said, "I'm not sure that I fully understand what the Treasury Secretary may have been attempting to convey with that latter somewhat lengthy statement, or words to that effect." And the whole committee just fell about laughing, because the reference to the Wall Street Journal article and to the intellectual confusion of his adversary was obvious. And so Brady was embarrassed, and Brady backed off. Brady stopped attacking Greenspan, stopped trying to take some of the regulatory authority away from the Fed, which was another battle that was going on at the time. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Fed is always going to be in the line of political pressure, always at risk from political pressure. Right now, not only has Trump attacked Yellen during the campaign, but if you look at the logic of Trump's fiscal policy, it is pretty inflationary. We're already at a time when the Fed is set to raise interest rates next week. The growth in the most recently reported quarter was 2.9%, even if you adjust that a bit for distortions from inventory building. It's probably above trend, what most people think of as the trend growth rate. Employment is now well below 5%. If you look at unemployment, if you look at the headline number, and if you think about discouraged workers and you go through all those arguments, it still feels as though employment is pretty near full. So the Fed is set to raise interest rates anyway, and you have the president-elect arriving and promising to do an infrastructure program, which would add to demand, to do a tax cut, which would add to demand, to do trade protection, which would reduce supply, and potentially to restrict migrant workers, which would further reduce supply. So all these four policies, if they are implemented, will tend to add inflationary fuel to what is already a potentially somewhat inflationary moment. So the Fed is going to want to raise interest rates faster than it otherwise would have done, and that will tend to push up the dollar. And Donald Trump will not be happy with this, because a strong dollar is bad for manufacturing jobs. And if anything, it's going to suck in more immigrants into the US, because if you're a Latin American worker and you're thinking of remitting money back to your family at home, coming to the US and earning a dollar income when the dollar is strong is obviously more attractive. So the Fed's logical response to the inflationary policies as set out by the president-elect, the Fed's logical response is to raise interest rates. The raising of interest rates means a strong dollar. The strong dollar means the undermining of Trump's campaign promises. So I think the stage is set for a fight between the central bank and the executive branch in a way that we've forgotten, because it hasn't been there for a quarter of a century. And my point to you is that if you want to understand how the Fed could fight back, it pays to understand the political tactics and style of Alan Greenspan. Let me make one final type of observation about Greenspan's career, which I think is also relevant to today. I came to the conclusion, sort of one of the central, intellectual fascinations of doing this book was the idea that, Greenspan's public life, beginning in the late 60s when he advised Nixon, ending in 2006 when he retired from the Fed on the eve of the financial crisis, that these 4 decades were the period of the making of modern finance. The story begins at a time when there are no financial derivatives, when interest rates don't fluctuate very much because they are capped by Regulation Q, which prevents banks from raising deposit interest rates above the cap. So not much fluctuation in interest rates, no fluctuation in the exchange rate because of the Bretton Woods gold peg. So modern finance hasn't been created yet. And then over the next 4 decades, the entire freewheeling free-for-all that we know of today was created. And if you wanted to pick one person who was at or near the center of this process of creating modern finance, it was Greenspan, as I've explained. So I thought that by getting into the cockpit with Greenspan and flying over that territory and understanding the logic that went into decisions that contributed to the making of modern finance, one would understand why intelligent people who were thoughtful and trying to do their best did not, created a system that proved so fragile at such cost to the economy. And so having gone through that process and sort of understood what Greenspan and his colleagues and contemporaries were thinking as they made the decisions that built the modern financial system, it leads me to a view of where financial fragility originates that is, I think, at odds with some of the conventional wisdom. And I think this may prove to be relevant for the next few years. So what I mean is that some people think there was a crisis in 2008 because the system was controlled by naive believers in the self-policing efficiency of markets. Having studied Greenspan, I can tell you that he didn't believe naively in the self-policing efficiency of markets. This is a person who never believed in the efficient market hypothesis. He was trained as an economist before that hypothesis was really ensconced as the conventional wisdom. And he came from an era of graduate school in 1950, so well before academic finance sort of got committed to EMH. He believed so much that markets were inefficient that he bought himself a seat on the Commodities Exchange in New York so he could make money by trading against these obviously inefficient prices. He lived through crisis after crisis, from Penn Central in 1970, through in his own tenure, the crash of October 1987 as soon as he got into office, the savings and loans crisis, the Mexico crisis, the Russia crisis, long-term capital management blowing up, a mini derivatives crisis when Orange County in California lost tons of money because of a derivatives portfolio that was badly constructed. I mean, there were financial mishaps after financial mishaps. So the idea that he thought this was all fine and stable and self-policing is simply false. And in fact, when you read all the speeches and commentary he did during his life, he was constantly referring to the danger of bubbles, the danger of mistakes in the financial system. So my point is, we did not have a crisis because people were intellectually naive about financial stability. We did have a crisis because although people understood that finance was fragile, they didn't act. So the mystery is, why did Greenspan not act? He was the man who knew, but he was not the man who acted. And the answer I have is that he faced political constraints. There were political constraints on his ability to act, even though he understood that in the 2000s, the subprime business was extending credit that was dangerous and in many cases would not be repaid. If you think that politics is the constraint, you have to ask yourself today, is politics more of a constraint in Washington or less of a constraint in Washington? Has the political climate become more enabling towards the Fed or less enabling towards the Fed doing what it thinks is right? And I think it's pretty obvious that politics has grown more divided and more toxic and more hostile to the idea that you should empower experts to do the right thing. So I do think that this perspective that politics and political constraints were more important than failures of analysis and understanding is extremely important. Now, I want to acknowledge that there is some debate about this interpretation I have of the last Greenspan period. Ben Bernanke, wrote a very gracious and quite thorough and long response to my book, which he posted on his blog. And I was delighted that he did that. The second sentence was, highly recommended, full stop. So I'm not going to quibble with the fact that he wrote it, but he does disagree with some of my conclusions. And so I wrote a response which I put on the Financial Times Alphaville website. And basically the debate is as follows, and maybe this will be a good place to end and it will spark some questions. In my view, what we saw in the 2000s was that the Fed, contrary to how people remember it, did try to use regulation to clamp down on some of the excess risk. So I'll give you some examples. In 2001, the Fed adopted new rules on subprime mortgages and banned the most dangerous sort. In fact, the Fed staff did a study and estimated that about 1/3 of the most dangerous mortgages, most dangerous subprime mortgages, would be prevented by these new rules. Now, nobody remembers this. Why? Because the rules had almost no effect. They were totally circumvented. Why were they circumvented? Well, two reasons. First of all, the industry, having been banned from doing one sort of abuse, could easily invent 3 more new abuses. It's easy for the industry to root around regulation. That's why regulation Sounds like an obvious thing. Oh, of course, after 2008, we should just regulate these people in Wall Street and just fix the problem. Well, it's not that easy because it's smart, they're smart, and they can invent new tricks. The other reason why those rules in 2001 on subprime didn't work is that although the Fed had the authority to write the rules, the enforcement and supervision to make those rules actually stick was shared between an alphabet soup of other agencies in Washington. So, for example, when it came to non-bank mortgage originators, the authority to oversee those is the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. Now, the number of supervisors at the FTC is quite easy to remember because it's a round number. 0. They don't do supervision. They do enforcement. They wait for somebody to bring a case, and then they might bring, they wait for somebody to bring a complaint, and then they might bring a case. But they don't do proactive supervision. So the Fed could write the rules, but were the rules going to be obeyed and observed? Not if it wasn't supervised. And so this balkanization of regulatory agencies is an important part of understanding why to believe that we will prevent the next crisis through regulation is, I think, a bit wishful. Another example is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Greenspan recognized in 2004 that these were dangerous, that they were way too big, taking way too much risk, backed by taxpayers. So he made a coalition with the White House, and he went to Congress and urged that the size of Fannie and Freddie should be capped. And he made some headway with the help of the White House, arguing that the portfolio limits needed to be legislated. There was going to be a second hearing to follow up on the first one. And on the day of the second hearing, a TV ad appeared in Washington, paid for by Fannie and Freddie. And the TV ad showed a nice couple where one of them says to the other, "Oh, we were planning on getting that new home, but now I hear that Congress is going to stop us from getting it." "Yes," says the other one, "Congress wants to take away our shot at the American dream." And so you can imagine the kind of dialogue that goes on. And the point of the ad was simply to warn members of Congress that should they be so stupid as to support Greenspan in this reform, they could expect a barrage of these negative ads in their own districts. Lo and behold, political support for capping the size of Fannie and Freddie evaporated. So it's not that Greenspan failed to see that there were potential dangers. It's not that he even did nothing about acting, but the action was not enough, the action was too difficult, the action faced political constraints. So I argue that you cannot simply rely on using regulatory policy to prevent the next blow-up. I think that sometimes the central bank has to raise interest rates when it sees financial bubbles emerging. This is what Ben Bernanke doesn't agree with. He thinks that interest rates should be used only to stabilize inflation. Price stability, I think price stability is all very well, but financial stability is actually more important. We overlearned, I say, the lesson from the 1970s, which was that inflation can be costly. Actually, the economic literature on the difference between having 2% inflation or 4% or even 6% inflation, it's very hard to pin down what the benefits are. Greenspan tried very hard in the 90s. He had one member of staff who was tasked with finding the link that Greenspan was sure existed between productivity growth and low and stable inflation. Greenspan had one of those early cell phones, one of those very big clunky ones, and he would use it from his car to call up this economist on the staff and demand the latest output from the regression that was going to prove that productivity gains were enhanced by low and stable inflation. No such correlation could be found, despite multiple attempts to torture the data. So it's actually quite difficult to show what the real benefits, below a certain limit. You don't want hyperinflation, but once you're, let's say, below 6%, some people say 10%, it's really hard to demonstrate what the benefits are, even though intuitively we understand that it's better if the money in your pocket today is going to be worth the same in a year's time. On the other hand, we know that financial crises can be extremely costly. So I think that interest rates need to be used sometimes to fight bubbles. But I fear that in the climate that I've been discussing, with the central bank facing political attack from the president-elect, from some members of Congress, that it will be even more difficult than it was in Greenspan's time to muster the courage to use an interest rate lever to fight a potential bubble. So I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Sebastian. Now we'll go out to the audience for questions, please. If you have a question, raise your arm, wait for the mic and make sure your question's a question. Maybe actually I'm curious about something. You talked about Ben Bernanke doing a review on his blog, and I know Randy Krosner here at UFC did a Wall Street Journal review. What did Alan Greenspan say about the book?
Well, that's a great question. So Alan Greenspan was a very generous collaborator. I'd had a previous experience, and I'm going to answer your question, but just slight detour, which is that the book I wrote about the World Bank had at its center the man who was the president of the World Bank from 1995 to 2005, Jim Wolfensohn. And Jim Wolfensohn was a force of nature, a tremendous networker, sort of, relationship banker who had, an enormous Rolodex and, played the cello beautifully, had been in the Olympics and was an altogether, swell guy. And I described in my book, Leading the World Bank, and I said that, he was a force for good. But as one friend of Jim said, he's like a current account surplus. He's net positive, but there's quite a big negative number on the other side of the ledger. And one of his weaknesses was that he had a slightly thin skin. And when my book came out, and I showed him as being net positive, but with some issues, he completely went crazy. And he got so angry that he ordered the World Bank bookshop, which had ordered big piles of my book, to hide them or take them away or throw them away. So they were behind the counter. You had to go up to the counter and say, blah, 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 blah. And then you got it in a brown paper bag. And Wolfensohn was still so furious that he couldn't function for a bit. And his staff, to try and get him out of his funk, thought, okay, so who is a friend of Jim's, somebody in Washington, highly respected, who will call him up and say, look, Jim, it's just a book, get over it, it doesn't matter, move on. So they heard, ding, I know what, we'll get Alan Greenspan to call Jim Wolfensohn and calm him down. So Greenspan did this and told Jim, just a book, whatever, city writer, ignore it. So when I approached Greenspan, I wasn't 100% optimistic that he would agree to speak to me. So he thought about it. I knew I had some hope because he had liked my other book about hedge funds, and he had cited it in a paper he wrote about the crisis for the Brookings Institution. So I knew he liked that book at least. So anyway, Greenspan sort of heard my suggestion. I proposed the idea of this biography. He thought about it for about a month. He came back to me and said, okay, I've read your things. I think you make fair judgments. I will talk to you. So we talked, and then we talked a bit more. And after 70 hours of recording interviews, I stopped counting how many hours it was. And at the end of it all, I didn't have any agreement or obligation to show him the manuscript. But a couple of friends of mine who are very respected historians advised me, well, you should show it to him because, he's been very open with you and you want to submit your research to a final test to see if he spots any mistakes. So I thought about it and I showed him the manuscript, and after reading it, he called me up and he said, okay, so it's not always positive, but it is accurate. I want to raise 5 issues with you, but broadly, 5 issues is not very many in a long book. So he was remarkably generous in the reaction then. And since the book came out, he did call me up once and say he'd spotted an important error on page 521 because I used the net number and not the gross number for investment changes in the fourth quarter of 2001.
Right. Terrific. Let's go to Phil Levy, our senior fellow on the global economy, right here in the front row, please.
Sebastian, thank you very much. The theory by which we have an independent central bank is that this is largely a technocratic exercise, that you can either target inflation or, in our case, inflation and unemployment, but you leave it to experts. You talk about the politicization. Does that lead you to question sort of the structure we have and whether we should have independent central banks?
So, Phil, of course, you're right that there was a sort of, in some countries, an explicit contract that you got central bank independence because there was a clear 2% inflation target. So the political bosses had decided what the target would be, and then it was simply, as you say, just a technocratic matter to deliver the target. So you could, without compromising democracy, delegate that to the economists. In the US, it was not an explicit contract, but it's an implicit one. So I think part of the attacks on the central bank that you've had recently reflect the fact that, what appeared to be technocratic and dull has turned out to be dramatic and a bit of a Superman act. And in fact, you can find cartoons online of, Ben Bernanke in his shirt and tie, but kind of ripping open the shirt to show the, Superman spandex undervest with that thrilling, yellow S emblazoned on his chest. So once the central bank becomes more than just boring and technocratic, then politicians inevitably start to say, whoa, these guys are not elected. And I think that's inevitable. And I think that, we'd already seen, in the campaign, not just from Donald Trump, but on the left, there was this fed up movement which argued that the whole structure of the regional feds should be rethought, that the role of private banks on the boards of the regional feds should be ended. And Hillary Clinton had endorsed tentatively that idea. And then there's all kinds of people in the Congress who want to audit the Fed and so forth. So it's not just Trump. I mean, this is a broad thing. And in fact, in Britain, you've also seen attacks on the central bank too, for the same kinds of reasons. Once the technocrats are doing more, inevitably they attract more scrutiny and more political pushback. So in my view, the question is, this political tension will be there. And the question is, how do you manage it? And my worry is that, whereas Alan Greenspan, in the Greenspan era, if you asked how much of the signal that you're hearing from the central bank, how much of that signal comes from Alan Greenspan himself, and how much of it is other people at the Fed, roughly speaking, in the Greenspan era, the signal coming out of the Fed was 99% Alan Greenspan. Right now with Janet Yellen, it's a much more democratic system. All the governors speak. They get a lot of attention because it's perceived that the setting of interest rates is actually a debate in the committee as opposed to something heavily dominated by the chairman. And so if you ask how much of the signal coming out of the Fed right now is Janet Yellen, you probably might say 50%. So that's fine in good times when everything is stable. But when the Fed is being attacked politically, I think the counterattack will only be heard and will only be effective if it's one strong, powerful voice. I fear that Janet Yellen's style of leadership is a little bit too democratic, and that she could learn, the imperial Greenspan chairmanship, which, encompassed tricks to make other Fed, leaders essentially follow his lead. I think wasn't terribly open, wasn't terribly democratic perhaps, but it was pretty effective in terms of establishing Fed independence.
Great, thank you. Yes, the gentleman here in the fourth row, please.
Since, as you mentioned, the market players are so clever about getting around regulations, do you ever see a form of Glass-Steagall or even higher capital requirements being imposed, or is the genie forever out of the bottle?
Part of the trouble here is that, they're both important issues, Glass-Steagall and capital. And for different reasons, it's very hard, capital is very hard to make it stick. This is another story I could have told about the period leading up to the 2008 crisis, because there was a moment when Tim Geithner was appointed president of the New York Fed, and his whole background was crisis fighting. That's what he'd done when he was at the Treasury dealing with East Asia. That's what he's done when he was at the International Monetary Fund. So he arrived at the New York Fed thinking, okay, I'm the young, newly appointed leader here. Where do I make my mark? And kind of radical instability in finance was what he felt he was good at. So he was looking at how to make the system more resilient. And he said to Greenspan, I think there ought to be more capital. And Greenspan said, you're quite right, go do it. And he couldn't. And the reason he couldn't was that, the Fed supervises some of the big banks, but if you push more capital into those, you may just squeeze risk to another part of the balloon. The risk would go to the shadow banks and all the other players that you don't have supervisory authority over. So that's one reason why getting capital into the system is the right idea, but you sort of have to do it across the board. And then you get into other problems, which, when you say capital, you mean capital relative to assets. Now, do you mean assets, just purely assets, or should they be risk-weighted? Because obviously if they're risky assets, you need to hold more capital. Okay, now if it's risk-weighted, how do you define the risk in the different types of assets? Well, that's impossible because these assets change over time. You can't write one rule today that will be accurate in a year's time. So when you get into the details, what you get is the Basel process for writing capital rules, which is a completely opaque, nightmarish, detailed process that you have to go through, and you have to do your best. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't try on capital. I'm just pointing out realistically that it's tough to really make capital stick, both because of the definition of risk assets, and because of this point that risk, you squeeze one part of the balloon, the risk goes to the other parts in the non-banks and so forth. Now, so I think capital is the right idea. It's just a difficult idea to implement. And in fact, one of Greenspan's 5 points, which he raised with me when I showed him the manuscript, was that after the crisis, Greenspan has said there should be much more capital, and he wanted me to kind of stress that more. That's a matter of emphasis. But the point is that he agrees with you, more capital. On Glass-Steagall, it's complicated because, in a way, if you look at 2008, the big failures, Bear Stearns, not a universal bank, would not be affected by reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, nothing to do with Glass-Steagall. Lehman Brothers failed, nothing to do with Glass-Steagall, right? Merrill Lynch had to be absorbed by Bank of America. So when Merrill Lynch was going bad, nothing to do with Glass-Steagall. Fannie and Freddie blow up, nothing to do with it. There are a lot of these problems emerged in institutions which were not like Citi. Citi was a Glass-Steagall product, a repeal of Glass-Steagall product, and did have to be bailed out. But that's kind of the big one. And most of the other problems, I could mention AIG as well. AIG, Glass-Steagall is sort of neither here nor there. So I was always skeptical as to whether reinstating Glass-Steagall was kind of the answer. I sort of favor it, though, now. I've come around to it on the grounds that notwithstanding this litany of failures that were, in non-Glass-Steagall examples, anything that makes banks less complicated and smaller is probably going to make them better and easier to manage. And if they're easier to manage, maybe the risk management will be better. And I do think that the more you create these behemoth financial supermarkets, the more unmanageable they become. And so in the end, my view on financial regulation is that it's incredibly important. You've got to try. You shouldn't try only on one or two instruments, because the more you push on one or two instruments, the more, those get circumvented. So you have to have a kind of broad approach, including pushing derivatives onto exchanges and a number of other things. But it is, I'm realistic, or you might say pessimistic, about making these regulations really stick, which is why I come back to the point that you've got to raise interest rates sometimes if you see excess frothiness in the markets.
Next, Diane Swank here, please, in the second row.
Thank you so much. One of the things that struck me in the book was Alan's sort of realization that bailouts were just a fact of life. Even though he didn't believe in them, he had to go through several of them, even though he fought against them, and that they were part of political life. And, talking to people at the Fed in 2008, one of the things they say that was a tipping point that sort of they could never come back from was the loan to AIG, which Tim Geithner stayed away from the meeting, actually, that meeting in September, to execute, because everything was falling apart. It went from 75 to 85 billion, and the Fed had used its balance sheet, and that Congress was just absolutely appalled at that. Do you think that there was a shift because it was a financial institution and that was not a real economy sort of phenomena, or is this something more broadly? Because there seems to be, sympathy for bailout for real economy firms versus financial. But I just wondered where that breakdown occurred.
You mean, Dan? You mean when did the need to bail out financial firms become accepted, or?
It wasn't accepted. I mean, it was one of, so people within the Fed will tell me, the moment that they could not come back from was when they lent the money to AIG. And Congress was shocked that they had this balance sheet. They sort of missed, Econ 101, and didn't know they had a balance sheet to lend, or the lender of last resort, and it did stretch it a bit. But the idea that, Greenspan believed that, even though he hated bailouts and things, that they were a fact of political life. But during the crisis, they were the thing that came, the unraveling, and the hatred for the Fed was sort of hooked on that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, and I think also to Greenspan, the need to basically bail everything out in 2008 feels obvious from the prehistory, and you could have predicted it as early as 1984, when continental Illinois was bailed out. We think of Volcker again as the tough guy, but when it came to continental Illinois, he presided over the first too big to fail rescue by the feds. Greenspan, after that 1984 rescue, was forced to say that it might have been too risky to let continental Illinois go down because of the contagion risk. And so, Greenspan, the background here is he did oppose bailouts by instinct when President Ford said to New York City, drop dead. Really, that headline might have been Alan Greenspan to New York City, drop dead, because it was Greenspan's advice to Ford that said, look, no, this just creates moral hazard, a bad precedent. You can't just throw money at people who are irresponsible, because then everybody becomes irresponsible. So Greenspan went from being kind of anti-bailout into through the 70s to accepting bailouts in the 1980s, to then practicing bailouts when he became Fed chairman, and practicing them early and often to the point that he was known for the Greenspan put and for protecting people's backs. Whenever there was a downside, it appeared that he was there to do something. I think the response to long-term capital management in 1998, where the Fed not only brokered the recapitalization of long-term capital management, which the Fed didn't put money into, but it did convene the meeting. That's one thing. But the more important thing is that Greenspan used the Fed's powers to cut interest rates not once, but 3 times in the ensuing couple of months to stabilize the markets in response to that shock. So, Greenspan was completely accepting that, in a democratic system, people are not going to tolerate the pain of mass contagion and, a kind of 19th century style regime where there's no central bank, and when there's a crash, you have a huge, deep recession and people just have to suffer. That's not what we've signed up for in the late 20th century or the early 21st century. So when, on that Lehman weekend, when, Lehman had gone down, after Fannie and Freddie went down, and before Lehman went down, Greenspan was interviewed on TV and asked what he thought should happen to Lehman, and this was before the decision had been made. And he basically said you should bail it out. He would not have let it go. So I think, the logic of needing to bail things out was baked into the cake way before 2008. The Fed sort of had to do it. It maybe, let Lehman go because the world had to see the awfulness of the consequences of not bailing out before politically you could get away with doing AIG. But, it did what it had to do, and yes, there were political repercussions. But I actually think the bigger repercussions have to do with quantitative easing and the extension of that policy, the sense that the Fed is just sort of printing money without end. That's the persistent Fed action that I think offends people who are of that mind to criticize more than the immediate crisis bailout stuff.
Next question. Yeah, why don't we take the one in the back there, please?
Hi, your answer to the question about deregulation was well taken in the sense that there were blind spots to the regulatory regime, but I wonder if you could elaborate on your take on whether Greenspan contributed to the deregulatory environment that prevailed during the 2000s, that the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission really damned Greenspan for contributing to the systemic risk that built up in the United States before the crisis? Yeah,
I mean, that's a great question because that precisely sets up, the view that I don't agree with. Greenspan, as I've said, he begins with a a strong libertarian philosophical outlook in the 50s and 60s. Then he does this extraordinary intellectual migration from the libertarian fringe to the Republican mainstream to the Democratic mainstream, where he's happily working with the Clinton administration much more closely than he ever worked with a Republican administration. So he became highly pragmatic, very centrist. I mean, Larry Summers said to me, Greenspan was the last great bipartisan figure in Washington. So, that's his political trajectory. Now, specifically on regulatory policy, where was he? Well, there's a lot of mythology around this. I mean, one piece of mythology is that when it came to subprime regulation, the Fed governor, Ned Gramlich, told him that they should do something, and Greenspan shot it down. It's just not true. I mean, through Freedom of Information Act requests, I've read the discussion between Gramlich and Greenspan about subprime, and I see them agreeing with each other and adopting regulation. So this whole idea that Greenspan shot it down is just not true. I mean, I really reported this carefully. I spoke to Gramlich's widow. I spoke to all Gramlich's colleagues, the staff people under Gramlich. I really looked at this as much as you can look at it. And it just isn't right. The conventional story in the FDIC, it's not true. And there are other examples too. So a good one is derivatives regulation, where Brooksley Bourne, the head of the Commodities Future Trading Commission in 1998, proposed correctly that over-the-counter derivatives should be forced onto exchanges and clearinghouses. And this is the right policy, and this is the policy we adopted after 2008. Brooksley Bourne was correct, and Alan Greenspan opposed that reform. So this fits your story, or not your story, but the FCIC story, that Greenspan was this anti-regulation figure contributing to the trouble. And on derivatives, there is some truth in that, but in mitigation, one should point out that almost everybody in the system in Washington, opposed Brooksley Bourne's proposal because it was presented in a way that was just designed to make enemies. I mean, she was essentially claiming lots of turf for a small agency, the CFTC, such that all the other agencies in Washington immediately were against her. So that's the first reason why derivatives regulation failed at that point. Nothing to do with ideology, pure Washington turf politics. And then the next important thing was that, somebody like Bob Rubin, who by disposition was actually in favor of regulating derivatives, who was teased by Greenspan and by Larry Summers for, if you were playing tennis, you want to use a wooden racket, Bob, because you're so anti-derivative that you want the old-fashioned kind of finance, the wooden racket. And they lampooned him for being uncomfortable with financial derivatives. But Rubin, the wooden racket man, opposed an attempt to do the Brooksley Bourne regulation. Why? Because he made the pragmatic political judgment, which I think felt correct at the time, which was that, look, how many times have we introduced a banking modernization legislation in Congress, which finally was passed in 1999? The answer is, before it was passed, it was introduced 14 times. And each time it was lobbied to death and the sausage factory just choked. And no legislation was passed. Do you want to try and regulate derivatives and have every single OTC derivatives merchant come to Washington and lobby Congress and you'll get killed? What does that achieve? So there was a judgment that the political climate was not ripe for trying to regulate these things. And further that, regulation is constructive and good sometimes, but at the same time, it's not perfect. Markets are not efficient, but regulators aren't perfect either. So it was a mixture of pragmatic political judgments that combined to frustrate regulation of finance in this period. And the system evolved as it did, basically because technology drove securitization. A friend of mine did a calculation showing the cost of the computer hardware you needed to design a complex financial security. Between 1970 and 1990, the computer hardware cost fell by more than 99%. So the cost of manufacture of the security crashes by 99%. Of course, the supply of securities goes up. So there's a whole bunch of technological things that explain the rise of modern finance, globalization, cross-border moves of capital, explain some of the rise of modern finance. So it's not the case that, a kind of laissez-faire group created this. It's more that technology and other forces created it. Then there was a failure to put the cap on it. And that failure to put the cap on it has to do with political constraints, I think. So it's not to say that Greenspan's ideology wasn't what it was, which is, a libertarian bias. But I don't think one should weight that very much in explaining how modern finance developed.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, right here in the front row, please.
So I'm actually reading Ferguson's Kissinger book and your book back to back, which is interesting because they went to the same high school too in a similar time period. And I think both books are a little similar in the sense that, Ferguson's thesis, he's only one volume through, obviously, but Kissinger started as an idealist, but now he's known as a realpolitik guy, obviously, and there was a transformation there. And obviously a lot of you have been talking about is how Greenspan went on his own journey from a libertarian, hard Rand supporter to being very pragmatic and very, abandoning a lot of his earlier ideals. So from a psychological standpoint, to the ability that you were able to get in Greenspan's head, so to speak, to what extent do you think his transformation was, this is what's politically pragmatic, and this is where I can selfishly rise to power, and being the head of the Fed, I can't say I oppose the Fed, versus how much do you think he actually saw the error in his ways in terms of being against the Fed, being for a gold standard? How much do you think it was his own views actually changed regardless of the politics going on at the time?
I think it was a mixture. He definitely made a decision in the 60s and 70s that he enjoyed politics, he enjoyed power, he wanted to make a difference, he wanted to have an influence, and if he stuck to libertarian pamphleteering, which is what he'd done earlier on, he wouldn't have much impact. And he wanted to have impact. He wanted, he signed on to the Nixon campaign because a friend of his kind of got him in there. But once he was in there, he enjoyed it, and he became, he made that transformation, which I described, from writing these memos. I found all these memos in Pat Buchanan's basement, by the way. Pat Buchanan has two things in his basement. He's got a fantastic collection of guns and a fantastic collection of memos to Nixon from 67 and 68. So you see the transformation of Greenspan in this period to being more and more political in his advice. And he would say to me, when I was talking to him, it's not that I gave up my view of what the ideal society was. I still believe, that in an ideal society you would have a gold standard. But that doesn't work in a welfare state society. And so I have to accept the rules as I find them and operate within the system and obey the law and try to be pragmatic within that set of rules that I find. So part of it is this, you could call it a selfish thing that he wants to rise to power because he loves power. It's partly that. But it's also, I think, he wanted to make an impact for the good. And I think he did a lot of that too. And whether his views actually changed on things, I think on the gold standard they did change. Well before he became really powerful politically, I think he'd given up on gold. So on some things he changed, but on a lot of it was more a sort of, maybe this is a good sort of. Are we nearly the end?
Yeah,
Okay,
that was the last question.
Concluding thought from the biographer, as it were. I think a lot of what Greenspan did in his life can be explained by an intense desire to achieve recognition. That he'd from childhood had this feeling that he was a sideman, that relative to his vivacious mother, who was a single mother with a single son who never remarried, with all her love and attention focused on this one child, that because she was a vivacious figure who leant over the piano at family gatherings and sang in the manner of a torch singer, leaving Alan feeling shy and gauche off to the side of the room, he wanted recognition. And the kind of power of the single-minded devotion of his mother made him feel that he was special, but at the same time he was awkward off to the side, so he wasn't going to get the recognition of being special just by walking into a room and charming people. To earn the respect he felt he could earn, he had to do it by working hard and by achieving things, concrete, measurable achievements that the external world would recognize. So he did it first by making a huge amount of money rather young. Secondly, by dating lots of glamorous women. and thirdly, by attaining enormous amounts of power. And I think that drive and thirst for recognition knit together the different bits of Greenspan's otherwise very disparate and colorful life. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was marvelous. Sebastian will be signing the book, The Man Who Knew, over